anti-communist Vietnamese or US narratives. And here you see, and I took a photo as it flittered about on the screen, so it's not quite sharp in focus, but they had a so-called Vietnam timeline. KCTS is our local PBS station. And there they say in 1954, Vietnam signs the Geneva Accords and divides into two countries, right? And that is exactly an example of how we set up false narratives that then become very, very deeply embedded in the kind of public consciousness about when we think about Vietnam, oh, there are two countries, and it all goes back to Geneva. And I've now spent 2 weeks with you telling you that Geneva was actually very, very different. It specifically did not divide Vietnam into two countries. It actually said the opposite. And it was not just one Vietnam that signed, but that there was a Vietnamese state declared in 1954 that signed the Geneva Accords, but there was another state, an anti-communist state created in 1949 that specifically did not want to sign the Accords, but for whom the French signed. So this you have here. You have a very good example of this kind of very strange language that we're using, and then has this kind of snowball effects in then misunderstanding subsequent events as well. So this is here a very good example. And I tried to talk to KCTS at that time, and I said, I'm a prof, I'm an expert on this, and you got it wrong, and I think you should change it. And I was completely stonewalled. They had absolutely no interest in correcting that. So anyway, so now I know that it works, and I can show you a little bit more during today's lecture. So if you're ready, I'm ready too, and I'm happy to now launch. Launching as I often do with just a little bit of remembering what had come before. So I won't go back to Geneva, but you now know that so after 1956, we have a situation where the two all Vietnamese states still coexist. The DMZ is in existence, meant as a temporary conditional military demarcation line, now becomes an impenetrable demarcation between two states. But it doesn't mean that these two states do not claim each other's territory. So we're still in a situation like from 1949 on, where two exclusivist and eliminationist states exist. And I try to set up the screen so that I can write on the whiteboard and I can still talk to you. So this is the situation in 1956. Then I spent quite a bit of time to develop the argument that from 1955 on, these two all Vietnamese states are desperately trying to consolidate their state power in their respective zones that they're controlling. And the outcome is surprisingly similar. This is not an open warfare time, but a lot of people suffer because both states, one ruled from Hanoi, one from Saigon, are using really violent tactics to suppress opposition and to establish authoritarian regimes in their respective zones. So the details are different, of course. One is the anti-communist state terror campaigns in the South. In the North, it's these kind of land reform, the excesses of land reform and the suppression of intellectual dissent. But the bottom line is that, in fact, by the end of the 1950s, we have two zones of Vietnam controlled by all Vietnamese states that have established authoritarian or dictatorial regimes over these two settled zones. And if you're opposed to them, you are playing with fire. You could very well be arrested. In the North, it's usually then oftentimes public shaming, these kind of public criticism, thought reform, labor reform. In the South, oftentimes it's much more violent because it might immediately send you to torture in prison. or to execution, right? If you're labeled a communist, then you have tough cards in the southern zone of Vietnam at that point. The second argument I was making last week was that despite the similarities of northern and southern zones, there is, however, a big difference, and that is that both regimes do something that is completely rational from their standpoint, right? I mean, the northern zone, ruled by the Democratic Republic, realizes that with the denial of elections by the Republic and the United States, that another round of war is almost inevitable, and they're trying now to very quickly build an industrial base and gear up for the inevitable. And in the South, in particular, the Saigon government wants to avoid the elections, and they know that popular support is much weaker in the South for their regime than in the North for the enemy regime. And so they are trying to shore up the state as well. And they do that through particularly through three power bases: the Catholic minority, the urban wealthy, oftentimes absentee landlord class, and then the United States. And you see here in the background the US phases of involvement in Vietnam. And the first phase is 1954, nation building, right? And nation building was very much a militarization. I mean, there was all kinds of, beautiful rhetoric about building institutions and liberty and democracy, but this was window dressing. It was really to militarize that Saigon-based Vietnam very quickly, because there's a sense that it's on much shakier ground than the communist regime in the north. So the second argument was that while both regimes set up these authoritarian regimes and suppress opposition as kind of rational acts from each of their respective points of views, it comes at an immediate price for the southern regime. So the Saigon regime has to consolidate power at the price of alienating a lot of southern people, particularly in the countryside. They are losing out with state consolidation. Whereas in the north, state consolidation is in fact benefiting the majority of people in the countryside. And those who are losing are in fact an important but small minority, and that is, urban intellectuals, urban entrepreneurial class. But in Vietnam, a majority agricultural society, that's a minority. Right? So that is another point I wanted to emphasize. And the third and final argument that I want to remind you of is that contrary to what we are taught about the Vietnam War, that this was now, northern aggression against a separate southern Vietnamese country. In fact, the southern resistance starts over the objections of Hanoi. So the northern communist regime is in fact holding back southern exiles who are desperately pleading to be allowed to form resistance against the state violence happening against them in the South. And they finally give in 1959. In 1960, the National Liberation Front of Southern Vietnam, NLF, is formed by Southerners on Southern initiative, and then until about 1964, with very little, if not minimal, support from the northern half of the country. That's a very important point. And to emphasize that, I also showed you the map of 1963. Let me try to bring this up right now. How can I find this? See, this is where I'm learning right now.
That's okay. We can be guinea pigs.
We're all learning.
Yes. Rodney, you're here. Good.
I am here. Well, I don't know about there, but I'm here.
So I have the screenshots here. Let me see. That's so weird. Here. Anyway, I send it to you. So I think I'm going to give up here. Let me go back to full screen. No.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
No, that's a different photo that from that. Sorry. Okay, we're back, right? So, but you remember the map of 1963, just of the southern half of the country, so the southern zone, both claimed by the Republic and by the Democratic Republic. There you saw, eye test, about a third of the territory by 1963 has fallen under the control of the NLF. Now I've fiddled around, lost a whole minute. Here it is, of course, right in front of you.
Okay.
So here's that screenshot that I wanted to show you, but here now printed out. So you see about a third of the countryside south of the DMZ has been secured by a lightly supported homegrown Southern resistance movement against the Saigon government, which is now heavily supported by the United States. And I think that tells us something about the feelings in the countryside in particular. And remember,
what year did you say that was?
this was 1963.
Okay.
Okay, so this is at the end of a development from December 1960, when the NLF is formed. So within 2.5 years or so, they have really put the Saigon government on the defensive. Now, I want to say a few things about that and then move very quickly to 1963 and the end of the Ngo Dinh Diem government. Several points. One is I want to talk about ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And the second point I want to raise is, just by example for these early 1960s, is the example of the so-called strategic hamlets. Okay, so strategic hamlets, and I'm walking away from the laptop. If it's not close enough and you don't hear me, then please let me know. Okay.
Okay.
So we are now in the second phase of American involvement in Vietnam. The first phase started in 1954 as nation building. And by 1960, when the NLF arises and makes, in fact, pretty stunning gains in the countryside in a very short period of time, by 1961, there's really quite a lot of turmoil all over the southern half of the country. The Americans are now starting to send in military advisors to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, so ARVN in short, ARVN. And by the end of 1963, 64 or so, these advisors will number well over 20,000, maybe 25, 27,000. They're not allowed to be in combat, although some of them will see combat. But that's why we call the second phase of American involvement the advisory phase or counterinsurgency. And one of the prime examples of what people tried to do in counterinsurgency was strategic hamlets. Now that goes back to what we talked about in the French War, the nature of guerrilla warfare. There were 3 rules, right? I mean, guerrillas must not lose, conventional army must win. But the third one was also me meditating on what it means to be successful as guerrillas. And if it works, then we can assume that the overwhelming number of the people in that region are in some ways or another behind you. Otherwise, we cannot understand the map of 1963, because even coercion would backfire if most of the population is against you. Right? Then the danger of being ratted out to conventional forces who have mobility, artillery, air force, and all the array of modern weaponry at their behest is way too great. Okay, so we must assume that in the countryside is a lot of support for the NLF guerrillas now that are fighting basically on their own with very little support from the northern half. And the advisory phase has a second name, and that is counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency now tried to undermine the basis for success for the guerrillas. And here, one of the kind of catchphrases of the time that I'm sure that some of you have come across already is hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds. And one of the great delusions in Western discourses about guerrilla warfare that many post-colonial regimes were faced now with around the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, was that the post-colonial or the peasant anywhere in the so-called third world, the peasant is fundamentally non-political, right? So agency, Western observers did not give peasants agency. They thought they were basically too simple-minded. They wanted peace and quiet. They wanted just to till their lands, and that's it. That is, of course, a great mistake and a delusion, because it posited, that was true, that the NLF were in fact outside agitators that were using and intimidating the peasants around them to do their nasty business, okay? So out of this kind of misreading of the landscape of guerrilla warfare comes the idea of a strategic hamlet. And strategic hamlet posits that here we have an array of peasant villages. And the problem is that, particularly at night, the guerrillas are coming and they're intimidating the peasants, and they're laying traps for the Arvin and all that. So why don't we build in a kind of strategic location among these little villages, a fortified hamlet with a moat, with bamboo spikes, guard towers at every corner, and barbed wire. And inside we built these barracks for people, for all the peasants to come in at night. And they are safe because they are now in these strategic hamlets, guarded by the Arvin, safe from the external troublemakers, these communist insurgents. And then when day breaks and insurgents would be visible, then they can go out and happily till their fields as they want, and Arvin can just look over them and protect them, right? It looks great on paper, winning hearts and minds, because you assure that these peasants are now less harassed and they can do what they actually only want to do until their fields. But it is a fundamentally misreading of the nature of guerrilla warfare in the South, because the peasants were the guerrillas. They're not, you can't separate one from the other. Yes, NLF had some standing units, but mostly guerrilla activity takes place by, choosing a time and location for a surprise attack and mobilizing, the supporting peasants in that area, who then, strike in the dark of night and in the morning till their fields. So what strategic?
I have a question, if I can ask it.
Sure.
Can I? You say 1963. That was the year Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet. So the strategic hamlet started up in 1962 as a highly propagated, large-scale winning hearts and minds operation to basically cut off this communist insurgency by these external troublemakers, right? And the argument here I want to make is it's of course exactly counterproductive, because it is based on a fundamental misreading of the nature of guerrilla warfare in the South, that the peasants were actually political agents of their own will. They had a very clear understanding what was for their benefit, and they were the guerrillas. They were not kind of passive, manipulated, simple people, as the Americans and other Western narratives proclaimed. Right? And so the strategic hamlets, in fact, of course, are experienced by, these local peasants, wherever
You're breaking up.
Okay, so these peasants, now forced into the strategic hamlets, are of course experiencing this not as protection from evil outsiders, but as being forced into concentration camps, where they are now under the guard of the Arvin of a state that they don't accept. Right? So in other words, the strategic hamlets are backfiring because they only aggravate the anti-Saigon sentiments in the countryside, rather than actually bringing more hearts and minds to the cause. Okay. Now, when you read Viet Cong memoirs, some of you might have read it already. The author, who is a very high-ranking NLF cadre, says that actually one of his buddies was a high-ranking officer in Arvin, but was secretly working as an agent for the NLF, and that he was behind the strategic hamlets because he knew that it would only alienate the peasantry even more. And so he knew that it would actually weaken rather than strengthen Saigon and its army, right? So now that's a wild claim. It has never been proven because this friend in Arvin, this officer, will be killed in one of the Arvin coups and counter coups, to which I will turn in a second, okay? But this is all I want to say about strategic hamlets, because you find it a lot in the literature. It was highly propagated in its time as the kind of newfangled way of intervening in third worlds that are faced with a communist counterinsurgency, and yet it was really built on a fundamental misreading of the situation. Okay, so much about strategic hamlets. I want to talk a little bit about Arvin, because when you see this map, of course, what immediately comes to mind is, how can this be? I mean, you have these kind of ragtag guerrilla forces, not particularly well equipped. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, where you have logistical support, is still rudimentary in these early years of the 60s. They're basically on their own. They're trying to capture weapons, maybe, but how can they capture so much territory? And why is Arvin, which is highly militarized with the latest American weaponry, now with 25,000 American advisors, why is Arvin losing ground? Right? So Arvin is oftentimes in American literature kind of maligned as ineffective, corrupt. These were cowards. They ran at the first shot fired, and you sometimes read that from American military writings, and grudgingly acknowledging that the NLF were much more formidable opponents, and oftentimes saying that the Arvin were kind of wusses or so, right? I mean, so there's a little bit of racism involved there. And a lot of our Vietnamese American elders in the community, who oftentimes were officers or were in Arvin, are justifiably quite upset about this mischaracterization of Arvin. Now, here I want to briefly speak about this because, in fact, a Marxist historian, Gabriel Kolko, has made an argument that I actually find quite compelling. And it moves us away from understanding Arvin in this kind of, almost racist terms as kind of cowards, not up to snuff. He says, precisely because Arvin was the product of a hyper-militarization under nation building, Arvin, in fact, was one of the preferred vehicles for upward social mobility of Southern elites. So Southern urban elites, who were the core supporters of the Republic, anti-communist, property holders, upper middle classes, absentee landlords. They, as this new republic is established in 1955, now fully independent, swimming in money from the United States, they realize that going into Arvin and becoming an officer is your fastest way, not only to a military career, but also to upward social mobility. Because when you militarize a society, as the Republic was, then you have access to, all kinds of social connections and therefore economic benefits through military service. Right? And so he says, it is precisely because Arvin was set up not so much as a military fighting force in terms of its officer corps, but as a vehicle for upward social mobility and for political influence, that Arvin was, in fact, militarily not as effective as it could have been. So the other aspect here is that when the officer corps is focused on the social scene and elite benefits, it also gains an inordinate amount of political influence. And we will see very soon how this played out. But being focused always on the kind of social scene in Saigon, but also on the political factions that are now developing within Arvin and the officer corps, again, distracts from military ability and military capability and effectiveness. Now, contrast that with the People's Army of Vietnam, which in American discourses, we oftentimes mislabel the North Vietnamese army. But the People's Army of Vietnam, of the communist state, was under a very tight reign of the Communist Party. And so, they had political cadres in every unit and all that. And the party controlled the army, but it made sure that the army, therefore, was not involved in politics, nor in social circles. And it did what it was meant to do, and that is fight. Okay, so that I think is a very compelling argument to me to explain the comparative ineffectiveness of Arvin in fact, containing a local insurgency up to 1963. Okay. Okay, now, what about politics in Arvin? Well, I mean, Arvin was the army of the Republic under Ngo Dinh Diem, the so-called First Republic of Vietnam, which was a civilian government. It was, pro-Catholic authoritarian government under Ngo Dinh Diem, but it was heavily militarized. And so you see that over time, very quickly, several political factions emerge, networks of high officers. And increasingly, Arvin is unhappy with the autocratic style of Ngo Dinh Diem. And so from 1960 on, you actually have the beginning of several instances in which Arvin tries to overthrow the civilian government of Ngo Dinh Diem and take power itself. And this is done oftentimes among rival factions of officers who don't begrudge each other the success. And so some of these coup attempts fail precisely because then other officer factions are throwing their weight behind Ngo Dinh Diem and then crush the rebel faction. Right? So you see already in these early 1960s, in 1960 and 62, there are famous coup attempts by Arvin against its own government. How politicized Arvin is when it actually should be focused on fighting a military campaign against guerrillas in the countryside. Its focus most of the time is in the urban, social, political sector. Okay, so that's what I want to say about Arvin. Kind of also to explain that it is not something that we should, pull into this kind of a racial aspect that really irks so many Vietnamese exiles here in the United States. Okay, are there any questions?
Yeah.
So then we go quickly into 1963, because I really want to press on. In 1963, things come to a head. So over 2.5 years, the NLF guerrillas have gained a lot of the countryside. Arvin is oftentimes fraught with factional tensions. And the Ngoreng Ziem regime is actually drawing closer and closer to the inner circle, and is ever increasingly intolerant of including other voices and other opinions. And this comes to a head because of the pro-Catholic bias of the Ngoreng Ziem regime. And in the spring of 1963, things come to a head in the city of Hue, so in central Vietnam, the imperial city, which also happens to be a center of religious Buddhism as well as Catholicism. And the Buddhists want to fly the Buddhist festival flags on the annual day where the birthday of the Buddha is celebrated. And Ngoreng Ziem famously forbids it. And he says, publicly, only the flag of the Republic of Vietnam should be flown, no other flag. And Buddhism, in fact, is not a religion. And the irony is that Ngoreng Ziem here uses a holdover from colonial times, because the French had never recognized Buddhist as a freestanding religion. They had seen the Buddhist as a kind of cultural club, because it didn't have a pantheon, it didn't have something to do with heaven and afterlife. And so it wasn't legible to a Western religious viewer or reader. And so they basically denied the Buddhist church in Vietnam recognition, only as a cultural club. And Ngoreng Ziem in independent Republic of Vietnam, because he is biased towards Catholics, is actually never getting rid of this kind of insult to the Buddhist. And so the Buddhists say, well, you forbid us to fly our own festival flags, but we're looking at the Catholic churches in Hue, and they fly the Vatican flag, and you don't say anything. And so there are demonstrations, and in fact, the younger brother of Ngoreng Ziem, who was ruling over Hue as basically a violent warlord who had troops under his commands who were personally loyal to him, is ordering his troops to shoot into this demonstration, and people are getting killed, okay? And so at that point, the kind of simmering anger at the autocratic minority regime of Ngoreng Ziem is exploding in the southern zone of Vietnam. And Buddhists are now on the forefront of demonstrations, and soon enough they're joined in the summer of 1963 by students, organized students in Saigon, in Hue, in Da Nang, some of them infiltrated already by the NLF. And so there are violent clashes in the streets of the cities. Precisely the stronghold of the Republic, of the anti-communist Republic, was always the urban environment and the urbane population. And now they have a lot of trouble. So in 1963, things come to a head. And I'm sure you have seen photos of the burning monk, right? So there's a famous monk who is self-immolating, which is a traditional form of Buddhist protest. So they had lost already a third of the countryside. Arvin wasn't really looking primarily at fighting an insurgency in the countryside. They were very much involved in the politics and social scene of the urban core, and the urban core now is destabilizing. And so there is a real danger that the Republic becomes weaker and weaker, and the United States is very concerned. And once again, in the summer of 1963, there are coup plotters in Arvin, so high generals, who are actually approaching the embassy and the CIA and saying, you know, we're thinking about overthrowing Ngoreng Ziem because the anger that he provokes among the population is really threatening our project of an anti-communist state. And at that point, the United States is arguing against a coup. But we're now getting into the fall of 1963, and things get ever more wobbly in Saigon in particular. Ngô Đình Diệm has started to, in fact, lay siege to Buddhist pagodas, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Buddhist monks are imprisoned. I mean, it's a total mess. And in October, once again, Arvin coup plotters approached the embassy and the CIA. And at that point, there is a decision made in Washington and then transmitted through the embassy that the United States would not be averse to Arvin overthrowing Ngô Đình Diệm. So the very person that the United States had built up over the previous years and who had done the almost impossible of stabilizing in the southern zone of Vietnam an anti-communist regime in the turmoil of post-Geneva, this very person now is standing in the way of the ultimate American objective, which is to have a stable anti-communist bulwark in the southern half of the country, right? What the United States now calls habitually South Vietnam, right? So the American rhetoric now has moved squarely into seeing South Vietnam, south of the DMZ, as a separate country, in contradiction to how Vietnamese saw the scene, right? So South Vietnam, in the American view, as a stable anti-communist bulwark against further communist encroachment, is in imminent jeopardy. And so they give the green light to have Ngô Đình Diệm overthrown, and that happens on 1st November 1963. Okay, and on 2nd November, Ngô Đình Diệm, who had been in touch by telephone with the ambassador, and the ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, had given him actually assurances of free passage out of the country if he gave himself up. He gives himself up, and Arvin officers pick him up, and he is executed with his brother on the spot. So he comes, Ngô Đình Diệm government comes to a bloody end in November 1963, and Rodney, this is now the coincidence, right? Just 3 weeks later, the very American president who gave the green light for the overthrow of Ngô Đình Diệm is then assassinated himself in Dallas, Texas. Okay, so this is November 1963, where in both countries things don't end very well for the leadership.
That triggers my mind, because you talked about a Vatican flag at that time, and this was incredible things happening in the Catholic Church. It was the council, and John the 23rd, I think, was still, I don't remember when he died, but he was an incredible leader, and there was Catholic movement and meetings, political meetings within the Catholic Church for several years in the early 60s in the Vatican, and very ecumenical, very wanting to reach out to other faiths and so forth. I'm very curious about how that all plays into this picture, because it sounds like it was all connected.
Yeah, and we should not make the mistake of saying that the Catholics were the bad guys in southern Vietnam at that point. I mean, it happened to be a regime that was led by a Catholic, and who was obviously, because he had to rely on Catholics as one of his 3 power bases, was exhibiting a clear bias towards them. That means that the average layperson, many of them might not even have been very happy with the regime itself. And so now we are in 1963, and the overthrow of Ngô Đình Diệm. Right? And the Americans are hoping that with Arvin now in charge, so the coup leader becomes the new head of government in Saigon, now under a military regime, a junta, that things would now be stabilizing, and that Arvin could now finally focus on the fight in the countryside. And the opposite is true. So the overthrow of Ngô Đình Diệm, rather than stabilizing things, is in fact making the southern half of the country ever more in jeopardy. Okay, so why? Well, because the old problems of ARVN come to the fore, and that is its factionalism. And so we have what we now call the so-called interregnum. So between 64, 65 mainly. So for 2 years, military juntas follow each other in Saigon because various rival factions cannot abide by having their rival having taken the reins. And so we have something like the revolving doors of coups and counter coups in Saigon, starting with obviously the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem, but very soon in early 1964, we have kind of an average length of any regime lasting not longer than 3 months. Before then a rival faction of ARVN is overthrowing them and installing their own leader. So things actually get from bad to worse from an American point of view. And the Americans are now drawing up in early 1964 plans for direct intervention. Because it's not so much important, you know, who's in charge in Saigon. The overall objective of American interest, strategic interest in Vietnam, is to have a stable anti-communist bulwark in what the Americans call South Vietnam as a separate country from the North. Okay, so that's the prime objective. And if ARVN isn't doing the job, then American intervention is necessary. And so intervention plans are drawn up in early 1964. Okay, so we come to August 1964, unless there are questions.
Yeah, I would have a question. I would have a question about how, with Kennedy's assassination, if there are any connections, because I get very suspicious that there may be some connections with Kennedy's assassination and what's going on in Vietnam.
I don't think so. Vietnam in the early 1960s is not particularly in the mind of the American public. It's not. It doesn't play a big role. It was a little bit of an irritant for John F.
No,
Kennedy.
but you have back channels that are operating, and obviously something came in there that took out Kennedy, which was huge.
Right. You know, there have been. Yeah, there are all kinds of theories about Kennedy's assassination. I don't really see any connection between Kennedy's decision to give the green light to the ARVN overthrowing Ngo Dinh Diem than his own assassination. And then LBJ is following in, of course, in his footsteps. Right. So, with your permission, I will now wipe this off, and we'll go to 1964. And you will see that I had left the end dates of these various phases open, right? So we have here 1954 nation building, and then 1960 advisory phase or counterinsurgency. And in fact, these two meld together. Right? There's not an endpoint to nation building, but we can say that by early 1964, clearly nation building had not worked, and counterinsurgency with advisors to the ARVN also had not worked. It had failed, right? And so therefore, we're entering a new phase of American involvement in Vietnam, and that is 1964 on what I would call the escalation phase. Okay. So that leads me to introduce to you a thesis that I come up with. Let me see if I can get to it pretty quickly here. And that thesis says, and it's right here, right? The thesis says revolutionary forces since the 1940s. I can't read it because it's held the political moral advantage, could insist on political solutions, whereas their opponents, time and time again, could only resort to military escalation. Okay, so that's a thesis that I'm now putting in front of you. at the appropriate time in 1964, right? So, and I formulated the thesis that way because it flies in the face of the kind of grand narrative of American involvement in Vietnam that we are used to in American narratives, which is America is intervening to save South Vietnam from a separate North Vietnamese country that is communist ruled and that is the aggressor that by force is trying to impose its will on South Vietnam. Right? But my argument here is that, in fact, it is revolutionary forces who don't necessarily have to escalate militarily because they have the political advantage. And when I mean moral advantage, it doesn't mean that they are the better guys. That's not what I mean. But by moral advantage means that they have a much easier time kind of rallying, mobilizing people behind their cause. Tarafa, right, for example. The melding of national liberation rhetoric with the rhetoric of social revolution and social justice in the countryside, right? So you see that in Geneva, right? I mean, the Geneva Accords with the political roadmap of elections was very clearly in favor of the revolutionary forces because they had the political advantage. They had more people who were supporting them over their anti-communist rivals, right? And so it is, in fact, the other side that is continuously militarizing the conflict. You see that in the French attack in 1946. You see that in the so-called yellowing of the war in 1952 with setting up anti-communist Vietnamese armies. You see that with the denial of the elections and then nation building being focused very much on militarization of this southern-based state. Right? And so 1964 is another prime example for that. The NLF is actually reaching out and, you know, they have secured a lot of territory. The ARVN is in disarray. They're overthrowing each other rather than facing the enemy. And so NLF forces are in fact offering negotiations. And these negotiations are usually rejected by the United States. And instead, the United States is now building up plans for escalation. That is direct American intervention in southern Vietnam with direct military force, right? So this is where my thesis comes in. Rather than, you know, the revolutionary side being the ones who are continuously escalating military conflict, it is actually them who could wait out at certain moments and hope for political solutions because they knew that they would, it would be in their benefit. And the other side is the one who has to resort to military action, okay? And we can keep this thesis in mind because we can test that thesis at several other points later on, okay? So we come to August 1964. And we come to the Tonkin Gulf incident in 1964. Okay, and here I want to draw the map again very quickly. We have the DMZ, and this is the Tonkin Gulf here. Right, so shielded by Hainan Island, the Tonkin Gulf. Is that clear for you to see?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, main action in these years has always been the guerrilla warfare in the south. The north is basically at peace, has been at peace since 1954. So for about 10 years, the northern population had been at relative peace, okay? And, but there is, of course, also a kind of secret underbelly, so to say, of a warfare between the contending states. And that is, there's a secret war going on. And in 1964, that means, for example, that the republic, southern-based, but claiming all of Vietnam, is trying to infiltrate agents into the northern half to try to, you know, rustle up resistance, maybe do what the what the NLF has done in the south and have maybe resistance areas in the north against Hanoi. So we know that that's about 200 or so operations. None of them were successful, and none of them ever came back. So they were, found out and quickly captured by local militia. And the local population, usually they might not be particularly happy with Hanoi, but usually they are, rallying towards revolutionary goals. Okay, but here's something else, and that is off the coast of Vietnam. If we had traveled to Vietnam, we would see that actually there are oftentimes islands out just off the coast. Okay. And these islands, of course, they had military installations in this kind of very tense phase of the confrontation. And the United States had acquired, the CIA actually had acquired from Norway old speedboats, painted them over so they had no more signage, and given them to the ARVN, to the Navy of ARVN of the Republic, for raids north of the DMZ against northern military installations. Okay, so this is happening. This is called Oplan 34. So the operation is called Oplan 34. So these kind of secret ARVN Ranger raids against northern military installations. Okay, so from the south, and then they might be attacking military installations in the on these islands, right? And the United States is sending ships on patrol in the Tonkin Gulf, and the so at that point in the early 60s, international waters start pretty close to the sea. I think it's like 10 nautical miles or so. So pretty close to the coast is international waters, and that's where U.S. destroyers are patrolling. And in early August, that is the case. Right? So there are raids, unmarked raids by Southern forces against northern military installations, and the USS Maddox is patrolling just off the coast of Tonkin. And it's a spy ship, basically. It has all kind of radio equipment they can listen in. And so it's very clear what is going on. The raids go on. The local defenders on the islands go on their radio, and they radio the next superior on the mainland and saying, we're under attack, we're fighting back, what should we do? And then these next level of command goes further up the command. And the Maddox can listen in on all this and then glean information about command structure, troop strengths, and all of this of the enemy, okay? And the North Vietnamese, the military of the Democratic Republic, of course, puts two and two together. They've been under attack. The Maddox is out there. So they are actually sending torpedo boats against Maddox. The torpedoes fail, miss, and the Maddox shoots back. They sink one of the torpedo boats, they cripple another one, and that's the end of the story of this encounter. And that is, of course, reported back to Washington. And soon after, a second destroyer now is joining the USS Maddox, and that is the USS Turner Joy. And the Turner Joy, for those of us here in Seattle, is actually a local ship, because when you take the Bremerton ferry to Bremerton, which is a big US shipyard too, Navy shipyard, you see the Turner Joy as the museum ship right next to the landing on the ferry dock landing in Bremerton. So the Turner Joy is actually a historic ship, was in one of the historic incidents of the Vietnam War, and it's in Bremerton now. Anyway, the Turner Joy joins the Maddox a few nights later, and seas are very rough at night. And so the sonar readings give you a lot of false blips because of the movement of the ships. And so they don't really know if they're under attack, but Maddox, of course, had been under attack a few days before. And so out of good caution, they're just wildly firing into the night. And we know from Vietnamese sources that there was no second night of attack. And in the morning, there's no sign of enemy forces. There's no oil sheen. There's no debris. So the Maddox and the Turner-Joy report back to Washington that, we don't really know what happened. We can't say that we were under attack, but we might have been. We shot back, nothing happened. We didn't have any casualties. We don't see casualties on the other side, okay? The Tonkin Gulf becomes the precedent to now enact the plans for intervention that the United States had already drawn up in the first half of 1964. And that is because Lyndon Johnson is mischaracterizing what had happened in the Tonkin Gulf. So Lyndon Johnson goes to Congress and to the American public, and he says that American forces in peaceful missions in international waters off Vietnam had come under unprovoked and sustained communist attack, okay? So unprovoked and sustained. And unprovoked, of course, is a lie, because it was very clear to the Vietnamese that the Maddox and Turner-Joy were involved in hostile actions by ARVN Rangers against them and then spying on them. And sustained is, of course, a loaded term because, yes, there was one night of action, but in diplomatic affairs, you can always, kind of brush this under the rug and say, trigger happy local commanders and we'll move on. But sustained means they really meant it. They have not only attacked us by accident once, but they really mean to go to war with us. And so with this, what Senator Fulbright from Arkansas later called a presidential lie, Lyndon Johnson gets a full approval from Congress to do anything, to take any measures necessary to secure the safety and security of American forces in the region, okay? Only two senators, the House is unanimous, only two senators, one from Oregon, one from Alaska, are voting no. But otherwise, he has a blank check, as they say, to now implement intervention plans in Vietnam, okay? So this is the Tonkin Gulf incident, oftentimes also misunderstood. Some say it was invented, which is not true. Some say, yes, the communists did it all and we had to react, which is also not true. It's somewhere in the middle, but that is the best that I can tell you what happened in this famous Tonkin Gulf incident of 1964, right? So incomplete presentation of facts by Lyndon Johnson, to put it mildly, and then getting Congress to approve intervention. And the American public, of course, is at that point quite strongly behind American action in Vietnam, because they feel, they have been told, that this was, the United States has been under attack and it has to fight back. Right? So it is 6:03. And we are at a critical moment, and I think that's just the right time for me to take 5 minutes, and you take 5 minutes, and we can all scamper to the bathroom, and I'll drink.
I'll feed the dog.
Okay, and I'll drink a little bit and have a cough drop or so so that I can go on talking later.
Okay.
But I missed the last 5 minutes.
Sorry?
I missed the last 5 minutes. I had a important phone call come in. But anyway, so you're going to be back on in 5 minutes?
Yes.
Right time? Yes. Okay. I'm just very, thinking that this doesn't make sense. Kennedy was a PT boat commander in the 50s. I don't know where, but anyway. And
in World War II.
Oh, so it was way back before 45. But anyway, that experience would have been present to him. And it just, I'm just blown away by what's happening there and the American presence. I mean, you were talking about what, thousands of advisors being involved in this prior to
About
63?
25,000 by 1963, yes.
Where are all those people? And Kennedy would have been involved in those. I mean, he would have had military experience and his own feelings, I'm sure, very strong. But, and how do they play out?
At this point, we're now in 64 and Kennedy is dead. Okay.
No, prior to that.
This is Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
Give me a few minutes just to get my voice cord.
Yep. Okay, right.
Slouch. So I want to try one of those. I'm fine. The pool was better. You're right. Stretch your back. Massage your vertebrae. I'm afraid I won't get up if I get down there. No, it's over here. Over here. Oh, okay. No, that's what I'm gonna do when he's totally done. I don't think it will. coming back.
I have a quick question of you,
Of course.
Christoph. Is I've written in my notes, I actually took some time while I was just sitting at home here to type up my notes from all your lectures so that a year from now it'll be easier to review in my mind
Yeah.
and my written notes. And I kept spelling Viet Minh different ways. Is it M-I-N-H or M-E-I-N?
No, Viet Minh is M-I-N-H.
That's what I thought. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, are we back?
Yeah.
Dog is fed and all?
Mhm. He's been very quiet so far.
Yes.
Quiet. Very quiet.
Yeah.
Who?
In these
My
5
dog.
minutes,
Oh,
in these 5 minutes, I just got a text from my daughter that she got admitted to Scripps College, so she's very happy.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Yay.
congratulations.
Congratulations.
Should be on the West
Wonderful
Coast.
school. Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah.
we're in that phase where we're all waiting for college returns, right?
Mhm. And now they can't visit.
Yes. Exactly. Everything is canceled.
Was that her first choice or does she have another first choice?
It's a high choice. It's not her first one. I think she would like to go Brown. I'm not sure we can afford Brown, but
Okay, Scripps is closer to home, so.
yes.
Crystal ought to tell you her college entrance. It was quite a thing, I'll tell you, because she was bouncing around between Santa Clara and where else? Oh, Eastern Washington. No, what's in Walla Walla?
Oh,
Whitman.
Whitman, yes.
Whitman. She was accepted at Whitman, and she was she was put on a wait list for Georgetown.
Nice work.
And- Yeah.
Anyway, back to more sober business. Again, we're now moving into the phase of the war, which arguably was the worst of all the years of warfare that Vietnamese were facing, and Americans too. So the escalation phase is the phase where American forces are intervening directly. They're relegating ARVN to kind of a secondary role because they have kind of lost confidence in ARVN. And American forces are engaged basically on the front line, both from the air, but also importantly as ground forces. And so this kind of mirrors the initial phase of French involvement where the French are very confident that they can win this militarily outright. And that is the escalation phase as well. The Americans here are intervening in Vietnam with the objective of victory. Okay, outright military victory. They're very confident. And Joan, may I ask you kind of a personal question about your older brother, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you tell us the year when he passed away?
Well, it was May of 1969.
69.
He was drafted in 68 because he didn't go on to college. That was his first mistake.
Yeah.
And he was sent to Fly Coup in November of 68.
Yeah.
And then was killed May of 69. So he was only there 6 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was on a tank battalion. So it was a rocket attack and that was it.
Yeah.
But he did come home. That was the good news
Yeah.
because he was originally reported as an MIA, but
Yeah.
they were able to identify him and he came back.
May 69 is not in the escalation phase. It's actually in the next phase, right? Of Vietnamization. I just wanted to make sure that I, had this kind of on my radar. I don't want to be insensitive talking about things that might stir up.
No, your lectures have been great, and reading the books have been great to kind of help me process the whole thing and accept it and, move on.
Very good.
So yeah, no, I have no problem with any of it. The history is very interesting. To see us repeat the same mistakes of the French 20 years later, really?
Yeah.
We can't figure that out, and we're still making the same mistakes, because war is not the answer.
Yeah. So all this to preface again that we're now coming into an era that sees people on all sides doing terrible things. Many millions of people will suffer. Again, this is something that is beyond the ability of a lecturer. I could show you photos, I could show you videos. I don't think there's value in it. So what I'm trying to do, and what I'm trying to do with my students also in regular classes, is to simply look at some of the major events, draw the bigger conclusions, see the trajectories, strategic objectives of the various sides. So when we talk about the escalation phase, so the Tonkin Gulf incident, misrepresented by Lyndon Johnson to get the United States fully involved with the Tonkin Gulf resolution, means that he is now, for the first time, sending American bombers north of the DMZ. Okay, so immediately after the Tonkin Gulf, reacting to what Lyndon Johnson calls the unprovoked and sustained attacks by communist forces against peaceful American forces patrolling in international waters, he is starting to bomb areas directly north of the DMZ. And then later on, the bombing, in fact, involves the entire northern half of the country, what the United States calls North Vietnam. Okay. And escalation provokes counter-escalation, because by the end of 1964, a major event happens on the other side. And that is the United States now, the Hanoi, the Democratic Republic, for the first time decides to send regular forces down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into southern battlefields. Okay, so for the first time now, NLF forces are reinforced by regular army units of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Okay, and let's talk about sheer numbers. Because by early March 1965, the first regular armed forces of the United States are entering Vietnam. Okay, and they do that at Da Nang Harbor. So Da Nang is the port south of the DMZ, but up in central Vietnam, south of Hue, a natural port, and Da Nang will become one of the biggest American bases in the Vietnam War. It has the main American airfield, which becomes, some sources say the busiest, some say the second busiest airport in the world for much of the 1960s. Day and night, American bombers will leave Da Nang airfield on their missions. But in early March 1965, a Marine contingent from offshore ships is landing on the beaches of Da Nang. And I want to spend just a minute to paint this picture, because I think in the way that I present my lectures, because I want to show the ways in which the various parties were seeing events and how they interpret them. I want to spend a minute or so on the Marine landing in Da Nang, March 8, 1965. And if you want, you can just YouTube it. If you YouTube March 8, 1965, Marine landing Da Nang, I'm sure you will see some grainy black and white newsreels. And what you will see there is that from these offshore troop transporters, the Marine units are sent into this natural harbor and towards the beaches of Da Nang in landing craft with, the kind of reinforced tailgates. And then as they hit the surf and the beach, the tailgates go down, rattle down, and Marines in full battle gear are wading through the turf and onto the beaches. And some of them secure the beaches in full weapon, spread out in defensive positions, even though there's no enemy around. In fact, the Da Nang mayor has sent some Vietnamese young women in their aoyais, in their traditional dresses, and they have leis, and they welcome some of these American forces and give them, these flower garlands. But it's very clear that the Marine landing in Da Nang was for public consumption back home, right? So it's a war of images as well. And I think you're all old enough to immediately understand what was going on. Landing craft, tailgates rattling down in the surf, people, Marines storming the beaches.
World War II.
I'm sorry?
World War II.
Absolutely, right? In particular here, Iwo Jima and D-Day Normandy, right? Little biographical tidbit, my father was a Nazi draftee soldier, and he was in the second line of defense at Normandy. And he was wounded there for the second time. Anyways, just threw that in.
Yeah.
But, so very clearly evoking the image of Normandy. We are here to liberate these people from aggressors, from outside aggressors. And we're liberating South Vietnam now from these communist insurgents from North Vietnam. But what Americans, war planners hadn't really taken into consideration, I would think, is that for many Vietnamese, but particularly those who think in Tarafa lines, these images had a very different connotation, because the Da Nang beaches happened to be also, and I passed over this briefly in my earlier lecture, was actually the location of the very first French attack in 1858 against the independent Vietnamese kingdom. Right? You will remember that. It didn't have a very good outcome. The French were surrounded. They had tropical illnesses, and then they focused later on Cochin China, which they gained. Right? But Da Nang was the very first attack by the French in 1858, and on the very same beaches, the Marines land in 1965. Right? So the Marine landing, which was staged for American news consumption to evoke Normandy, D-Day, was in fact for Vietnamese a self-fulfilling prophecy of Tarafa, right? To be Vietnamese, it means to have to face recurring foreign aggression. They want to take away our independence, and to be a good Vietnamese means to rise up in heroic resistance against foreign aggression, right? Tarafa, you will remember that acronym from earlier. So this is the Marine landing of 1965, okay? So numbers. So after the Marine landing, very rapid US force introduction. By 1967, so nearly 2 years later, we are surpassing the 500,000 mark. So within 2 years, American forces in southern Vietnam, the southern half of Vietnam, have reached a 500,000 mark. And they will peak out, I think, in late 1968 at about 570,000. That is the highest number of American forces in Vietnam. And counter-escalation means that as of late 1964, the first regular forces of the People's Army are infiltrating into southern battlefields. And here the best number we have is about just under 200,000 at the peak. So the communist state, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, is sending about up to 200,000 forces south to reinforce the NLF. And that is, of course, as a clear reaction to the introduction of American forces that would clearly overwhelm the NLF. The NLF had been able to hold the ARVN at bay and even take about 1/3 of the Southern Territory. But it's very clear that with the Americans, it's a new phase of the war, and it requires much more a counterforce. Okay. Now, let me again take a moment here to talk about terminology, because these regular forces of the Democratic Republic are usually referred to in American discourses as the so-called NVA, North Vietnamese Army. You find that in all kinds of textbooks. Ken Burns and Lynn Novick in their documentary on the Vietnam War is replete with references to the North Vietnamese Army and the North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam. So it's all in this kind of American rhetorical construct of two separate countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and North Vietnam being an aggressor, an invader now into South Vietnam with these North Vietnamese army forces. Right? Now, needless to say, and I think you will not be surprised after listening to me for several weeks, NVA is, of course, a false term. Nobody calls, the Vietnamese didn't call this the North Vietnamese Army, because for them, there was only one Vietnam, and the forces of their state that they supported, the Democratic Republic, was called the People's Army of Vietnam. And they had every right to be in the southern half of their country, which was now invaded by American forces. Right? So these were not invaders from a revolutionary Vietnamese perspective. And likewise, if you look at the Republic had never given up, even though they were based in the southern half, they had never given up the claim to the north. And as you know, they had even attempted raids into the north by their own armed forces. Right? But here we have to be very careful again about American terminology, which kind of skews our understanding of what was going on in Vietnam. Right? NVA, invaders into South Vietnam, as a normative term to refer to the Republic. Okay, so this is in hard numbers, escalation and counter-escalation. Over 500,000 American forces in southern Vietnam, and just under 200,000 People's Army revolutionary forces now coming from the north as well. So you see that from 1964 to 65, you have a dramatic escalation of violence in the southern half of the country, with the introduction now of well over 500,000, 700,000 troops that had not been there before, right? ARVN, of course, and the NLF continue to fight as well. Okay, so that will account for why I'm saying that 65 to 68, 69 were possibly the most violent, the most desperately violent and bloody years of the conflict. Before we got into the kind of nitty-gritty, I want to briefly talk about regime stabilization. Because just like in the late 50s, both regimes had consolidated their power in the 1950s. And now with this new phase of the war, both regimes also feel that they need to restabilize. Now in Saigon, this is very obvious, right? Saigon had been in disarray since 1963. It was a barely functioning state in the so-called interregnum, with coups and counter coups, one military junta overthrowing the next one. And very much to the chagrin of the Americans, who found it very hard in their kind of propaganda to make the case that this was actually a Vietnam worth intervening in, under the rubric of freedom and democracy, when so obviously this was going way off the tracks in Saigon during these times. In fact, in 1965 and in early 1966, you have, early 66, in fact, you have open rebellion in the northern zone of southern Vietnam, so just south of the DMZ, in Hue and Da Nang. ARVN forces and the commander of that whole area is in open rebellion against Saigon. And ARVN forces from Saigon are fighting their way back into Da Nang and Hue. So there's actually ARVN fighting openly in warfare against one another in 1966. So this kind of Buddhist-led military uprising of ARVN forces in Hue and Da Nang has to be violently put down from Saigon. So you can see that this is a very, very wobbly thing. But then with the introduction of so many American forces who are now taking over primary fighting tasks in the southern countryside, the regime is able to stabilize. And that comes also with great American pressure. And in 1967, we have the so-called Second Republic. Okay? So the First Republic is under Ngori Ziem. And that is 1955 to 1963, right? And then we have the interregnum, 1964, 65, and then with 66, in fact, sorry. And then we finally have the stabilization with the Second Republic, RVN, as of 1967 until its demise in 1975 at the end of the war. Okay, so the Second Republic is constantly under military regimes. Okay, sometimes there are short interludes with civilian leadership, but even those civilian leaders are beholden to the generals. So the Second Republic is basically a military junta. And here, we don't really use too many names. I just want to mention two for those of you who actually might resonate, Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Thieu. Okay, so the two Nguyens. And they're not related. They're not related. They just happen to have the same last name. So the two Nguyens are high-ranking generals. Nguyen Cao Ky is in the Air Force and is in the Army. And they will be leading the Second Republic until almost the very end, April 1975, right? And Nguyen Van Thieu especially. So this is the Second Republic. It is able to stabilize because of American intervention. What is not so much known is that the Northern regime itself is also stabilizing. And that is the process of more orthodox or radical factions in the Communist Party taking over, that we had already briefly mentioned last time, is now in full force. And that is since by 1963, 64, actually into 1967. So for several years, there's basically a tug of war between the more hardline factions who are hardline factions in the party versus more moderate forces. Now, some people argue, and I think it's pretty pretty clearly now established, that Ho Chi Minh had already lost basically leadership function by about 1960-61. But the process really escalates around 1964 with American intervention. And in those years then thereafter, hardliners, so-called war faction, are completely in command. And those who are arguing for a more moderate line and maybe a wait and see attitude towards American intervention in the South are sidelined, under house arrest, some of them in prison, some of them publicly criticized. sometimes people draw this kind of map it out on a kind of Soviet Chinese communist split. The hardliners are more closely aligned with the communist China, more moderates with communist Soviet Union, but it's not quite exact. But why is that the case? Well, here I just want to give you one idea, and that is what I mentioned earlier. The northern half of the country had been in peace for about a decade, right? 1954 to 1964. And finally, in August 1964, for the first time, American bombs are falling on territory north of the DMZ. So the population now is getting involved in warfare. Southerners had, of course, experienced war basically since the NLF had started to resist in 1960, but Northerners had not. And here I want to alert you again to the notion of Vietnamese regionalism. Remember that this goes back already, several hundred years. And there was always a notion as Southerners, move into the Mekong Delta and further away from the traditional center, that there was a kind of a more heterodox Southern population versus the more orthodox, conservative, traditionalist Northerners. Right? And this kind of regionalism and this kind of inbuilt regional suspicion of one another, right? The Northerners look down to the Southerners, and they always see them as kind of iffy Vietnamese. They embrace too many other cultural influences and make, common cause with foreigners. And Southerners look north and say, the North can't dance, right? I mean, that's how I said it earlier to you already. And this is a real problem because Hanoi now has decided, with hardliners in command, Hanoi has decided to take the bait of the Americans and counter-escalate American escalation. They're committing now to full-out war opposing the Americans. And this is not, there's nothing says that this is inevitably going to be victorious. Everybody knows that taking on the Americans is going to mean a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, a lot of sacrifices, and the outcome is not foretold at all. But these hardliners in Hanoi are committing themselves to do that, but they also have to convince a population that the South is, so to say, worthy of these sacrifices, right? And Northerners who are kind of suspicious of Southerners. And look again, I mean, they made common cause in Cochinchina with the French. They invited the Americans in. Now there's a republic based in the South that is actually against us. So they have to play up, so to say, propagandistically, that what happened in the South was that there were a lot of supporters of the revolutionary state, the Democratic Republic, who are now on the receiving end of Saigon violence, right? I mean, that had motivated a lot of the NLF, and that had to be now played up because they have to make sure that Northerners are willing to endure the war coming north, at least air war coming north, and seeing this as worthy of their sacrifices to help out their Southern compatriots, okay? So this is how the communist government of the Democratic Republic is now positioning themselves propagandistically, right? We're helping our Southerners, our Southern brothers and sisters who are under attack by the American imperialists and their Vietnamese lapdogs, right? Or the traders of Saigon. And these upstanding citizens in the South have to be helped by us, okay? Who are these hardliners that come to power and who are, really strong-arming themselves into power and making sure that the moderates who say, is it really worth it to engage with the Americans? This is maybe too big of, an apple to bite into. They have sidelined these moderates. They are committed now to war. here again, two guys, both with the last family name, but not related. And their last name is Lê, okay?
Mhm.
The Republic, and then the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Two people, Lê Duẩn and Lê Đức with a hyphenated D, Tom. Lê Đức Thọ. Okay? So these are the two most important hardliners that have that gain power and consolidate power in the North. We weren't really aware in the West of that until much later, when finally archives became open and people were willing to speak more openly. It's a little bit under the radar in actual time, but it's very clear what happened then too, right? Regime consolidation, because American intervention is a whole new ballgame. And they need to make sure that everybody is now lining up, okay? So Lê Duẩn and Lê Đức Thọ. Okay.
Could I ask a question? If they didn't decide to take them on, if the conservatives didn't win, do you suspect the U.S. would have just basically divided the country, would have felt they'd won if they divided the country successfully and had a DMZ zone?
Well, yes, right? I mean,
So most of North
without-
Vietnam would have been okay without the war.
well, I mean, that is the question, right? That people are asking. I mean, is it worth potentially jeopardizing the revolutionary gains in the northern half of our country by fighting the Americans, and maybe have the Americans come up north and destroy us all?
Right. Okay.
Or should we maybe just acquiesce, gnashing our teeth, but acquiesce with the Americans now fully stabilizing the South under the anti-communist regime, and so to say, sacrificing our revolutionary supporters in the South, so that at least in the northern half of the country, we can have our revolutionary state, right? So that is basically the moderate position. Hardliners say absolutely not, right? And again, I think it has to do with the sense that I tried to formulate in my thesis, that they are well aware that they at least have a political advantage. And remember, guerrilla warfare, you must not lose, right? It's not that you have to win, you must not lose.
Mhm. Okay, thanks.
So now, I do want to, you see, I'm trying to avoid talking about the war because it's such a depressing issue. Let me give you another, a little pedagogical device that I use to drive this point home with my students, okay? Somebody is still on, maybe if you can mute everybody. There's on the bottom, there's a little button that says mute or unmute. If you all go to mute, then we don't hear background.
Can I ask this quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm a little
Taken, right?
Yeah, Megan.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused why the U.S. military decided to attack the North when really the issue that they had in reinforcing the South was with the NLF. So was there already a sense that the NLF was being heavily armed and supported by the North, or was it more just the imagery of we're taking the battle to the North?
Well, not only imagery, but probably really a conviction. They're starting to believe their own rhetorical field, right? Which had always posited Geneva divided the country into two countries. There's North Vietnam, South Vietnam. North Vietnam has no business in the South. And yet there is this kind of revolutionary resistance in the South. It cannot be other than directed by puppeteers in Hanoi, right? Hanoi, North Vietnam is intervening in South Vietnam, right? And so the decision by Lyndon Johnson to start bombing the northern half of the country, which he calls North Vietnam, was clearly to interrupt any possibility of North Vietnam helping out in the South, right? Of invading or supporting the Southern insurgents, right? So I think it's more than simply symbolic or simply, imagery, but clearly to send a signal was clear, right? I mean, we're now, if you don't hold off your northern refuge that you had for 10 years is now over.
Yeah.
Right? So all of the north is now under habitual, very heavy American bombardment. Right? But let me, before we go into these kind of very depressing things of 65 to 68, just show you a little of a pedagogical device that I have for my students. And I'm drawing them a map. And I don't think anybody of you has seen this, draw this map before. Tracy is not here. So I hope it's a surprise, okay? So here's the map, okay? And it goes something like this here. Okay, and just to, you see this map, right? You can see it clearly. Just to make sure that you understand what we're talking about, I'm gonna put in a river with a delta, okay? And do you know what map this is? So if you tilt your head by 90 degrees.
The United States. That's the Mississippi?
Yes, right? So this is the lower 48 that I taught myself to draw 90 degrees tilted, okay? And I'm using this to basically set up a parallel. It's an unbelievable tale, right? But let's imagine that Martians had control over the United States. And finally, after many years, the eastern half, up to the Mississippi of the United States, had come under Washington, D.C. control again, okay? But the western states, west of the Mississippi, is still under control of the Martians, and they have set up an American counter-government in, say, LA, okay? And, you know, every red-blooded patriot in the United States, of course, wants to defeat the Martians. And therefore, there is, of course, in the western states, west of the Mississippi, there is a resistance movement. And now regular forces of the US Army from, say, Ohio, Florida, Maine, Connecticut, Alabama, are crossing the Mississippi to help these patriots in the western states defeat the Martians. Right? But the Martians would now call the regular forces of the US Army, when they touch foot on territory west of the Mississippi, they would call them the invading East American Army. Okay? So then they would say, this is actually East America. And therefore, this is the East American Army. And this is West America. And the East American Army has no business there and is in fact an invading force. Right? So this is my device to really try that point home with students about the American framing of the conflict. For Vietnamese, to Rafa Vietnamese, it absolutely made no sense. Geneva had not divided Vietnam into two countries. It was one undivided country, albeit fought over by two contending states that saw themselves as all Vietnamese. And the denial of the election had in fact destroyed the Geneva Accords. And now we're back to square one. The DMZ is not a political border, right? It has kind of lost its kind of significance that for the Americans it was still there because the Americans rhetorically set it up as a political border between two separate countries, right? And then to call the People's Army of Vietnam going now into their own southern battlefields in their own southern half of the country, right? Just like the US Army would go to the western part of our United States, an invading force, an alien force invading East American Army has no business in West America, would sound absolutely absurd. And that is how I want my students to imagine the absurdity of listening to an American frame of the North Vietnamese army now invading South Vietnam. It can't be, because it's our own country, right? Okay, so it's a little bit hokey, I admit it, but it usually does the trick in really driving that point home.
In this time period, was there ever talk in American policy circles about this actually being a civil war, or did they not think that way until much later?
Well, of course there's a civil war, right? And the thing is that to admit it was a civil war is something that undercut, in fact, the major points that all the three combatants were making, right? Neither Hanoi really wanted to say it's a civil war, because for them it was Tarafa, right? It was the American imperialists, and maybe they had local lapdogs, you know, who were supporting them, but it was really to liberate the Southern compatriots from foreign aggression, right? So they don't really want to talk up civil war. Likewise, in the American frame, it's North Vietnam, which is a communist separate country, invading and being the aggressor against a freedom-loving, homogeneous South Vietnam. If they talk about civil war, then they have to acknowledge that actually the Southern resistance has legitimate grievances, right? So again, it's not really to the benefit of American framing. And of course, for Saigon, which is increasingly under pressure, military pressure, to also say that there's a civil war going on is also undercutting their increasingly fragile position. Right? And they have always said, we are the only Vietnamese state from the Chinese border down, and the northern half is simply under communist control. And these communists are not even really fully Vietnamese, right? They are traitors to the Vietnamese cause, and we can't wait to defeat them. And so again, in this hyper-ideological environment, what is most obvious, of course, that it has a strong aspect of civil war, Vietnamese against Vietnamese, is not in anybody's to anybody's benefit.
Yeah.
Right. So again, I'm running out of time, but let me go back to my maps. Okay, so the 1963 map here. Yellow is Saigon government, the Republic, and pink is the NLF. So now we come to 1965, and for the first time, the NLF is supported by regular forces from the north, so-called NVA, right, the East American Army. But for many Vietnamese of revolutionary convictions, this is the People's Army, legitimately in our own country, now helping finally out when the Americans have come with their own forces, right? And this is 65. Now, government is no longer yellow, but government is blue, Saigon government. And communist areas, communist or NLF areas with People's Army support is red. And contested areas are white, right? So you see that the interregnum has actually been terrible for the Republic. They have now lost so much territory. In 63, we have still about 2/3 of the southern half of the country under Republican control. Now, the blue areas is all they have left. Now, these are lowlands and many of the population centers, so the cities, but communists have been making full use of the disarray in politics and military life in the Republic. By 65, this is the case, right? So the majority of the country, of the southern half of the country, of the contested territory south of the DMZ, I should rather say, is now basically under communist power projection. Okay, now we go to 1967. Again, these are internal CIA maps that have only been declassified about 18 years ago or so. So there's a high confidence of their accuracy because they were meant for American military and political leadership eyes only. Okay, this is 67. Sorry, like this. Right now, 67. You see that the southern half of Vietnam, south of the DMZ, is completely fragmented. Right, and that has to do with this huge level of military violence that is engulfing the southern half of Vietnam with the introduction of American ground forces. So American ground forces patrolling, being in firefights all the time, and heavy American aerial bombardment of the South as well, have managed to disrupt contiguous territory held by communist forces, right? So communist areas have been fragmented as well. But more importantly, the Republican-held areas have been shrinking to a very small sliver of land, dots here and there, islands of territory held still, usually the cities, towns, even the connecting roads are no longer secure, right? So you see that American intervention has relegated the Republic to a secondary role to the point where they can't hold much territory outside the cities. And communist forces have a harder and harder time now even holding contiguous territory, but still have the upper hand. Okay, so this is the progression of these kind of three maps from 63 to 65 to 67. Just to illustrate the power of military violence that is now disrupting the fabric of Southern society to the point where it's completely shredded, right? So I just want to spend the last few minutes in just giving you a rundown of what we're talking about. Bombing. We're talking here about what rains down on Vietnam, probably about 9 times all of World War II combatants combined. Right, it's the explosive power of 9 times World War II, all sides, all theaters, raining down on the former countries of Indochina. Now, again, many Americans think that the most bombed territory was northern Vietnam. That is actually the least bombed territory, about 1 out of 1 to 10 or so. So 10% of American bombs rain down on northern Vietnam. They destroy all industries, military targets, everything is decentralized after 64. People are, school classes go into caves. In Dong Hoi, if we were there, you would see a bombed out church. So there's not very much left after a while. And, these are kind of harassment bombings. But remember that most of the fighting takes place in the southern half of Vietnam. And so that is where, in fact, 4 times the amount of bombing takes place compared to the northern half of the country, right? So in the South, you'll find an unending, relentless, 24/7, 365 bombing of the southern countryside to interrupt the NLF and the People's Army of Vietnam forces in the field that are in fighting in guerrilla fashion. Right? And then 30% or so is raining down over Laos. And that makes Laos the most heavily bombed country in the world in terms of proportion of population. And then only recently have we realized the extent of secret bombing of Cambodian territory under LBJ, but especially under Nixon later on, about 20%.
How much did you say for Laos?
Laos is about, so if you take 10, right, Northern Vietnam is 1, Laos is 3, Southern Vietnam is 4, Cambodia is 2. That's about the proportion of all this bombing that takes place. I will send you later on, when we have this video sent to you as a link, I will send you two short videos that show this bombing in Laos and Cambodia as graphs. So based on internal American Pentagon documents. Somebody took the pain to put this in a graph over time, these bombings. It's a very sobering thing, and that is, of course, where Peace Trees comes in. So it's 7 o'clock, and I didn't get to 58 as I wanted to, but we're out of time. So in 2 weeks, we're going to meet again. Remember, on the 24th, we're going to pause. On the 31st, we're going to meet again, and I'm going to bring it to 68. And then hopefully I can talk to you a little bit about the end of the war with the Paris Agreement, end of the war for America. I'm not sure I'll get you to 75. We might, if you want to, still have one more Tuesday evening to do this. But I hope that what I'm presenting to you is of interest to you and it makes sense. Even though I continuously fall behind in my projections of what I want to cover.
I just have one question, Christoph,
Sure, John.
about Pleiku, because Jennifer and I were going to visit Pleiku after your trip, and it's a government restricted area, and you only can go on government tours to get there. And I'm just curious, is it restricted because it's sacred ground because of all the losses, or is it because of the military complex they have there? Do you have any idea?
Sure. I'm not sure. I wasn't aware that it is so restricted up there. Just a few thoughts. One is that these are in the Central Highlands, Southern Central Highlands. So this is a territory where you have a lot of ethnic minorities. And ethnic minorities are a little bit troublesome to the central government, just like in many other countries. In Vietnam, because they're also, a lot of them are now in evangelical churches, which raises concerns with an authoritarian regime for potential conversion. So that could play a role because there are some ethnic troubles up in the highlands. The other thing is, I think if you want to go to Pleiku because your brother was there and maybe was killed up there.
Yes, he was.
You know, what I hear from Peace Trees and other friends in Vietnam is that the Vietnamese government is actually quite sympathetic to these kind of trips by family members, and they're actually trying to accommodate these trips. So I would be surprised if you found roadblocks, if that was clear that you wanted to go to a place that has a particular meaning for you, a familiar meaning to you.
Well, we did find a tour person,
but
you know,
it might
Crystal,
well be that
who
they
told
have
to take
a
us.
reminder then, so that you have to book through a certain agency, and there somebody will travel with you.
Right. No, they would take us there. So
Yes, and you will assume that this person, even though it might be a wonderful, friendly person, and you might be long-term friends afterwards, but that this person will have to report to authorities about it, right? It will likely happen then. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yep. I look forward to doing it next year.
Okay, good.
All
So I
do.
look forward to seeing all of you in 2 weeks. Please stay healthy and secluded.
Yes.
Make sure that we really break that chain reaction of an uncontrolled spread of the virus. So
Yeah, you stay safe as well.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
You stay safe as well.
Thank you. Yes.
So it'll be on Zoom again.
Yeah.
And congrats to your daughter and to you.
Thank you. Yes. My oldest daughter was at Stanford, and she had very suddenly, late Sunday, had a rideshare opportunity, and she threw things into her bag, and they left at 12:30, just hours before the Bay Area was shut down.
Oh my
And
goodness.
they went to Mount Shasta, had to have snow chains, fought their way into Oregon Monday morning, and and then I picked her up in Portland, and we brought her. So we are all 5. We are all at home, and we're secluded.
Good.
Yes.
Oh, good.
You know,
Time to be together.
yeah, of course, it's much nicer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so stay circumspect and healthy, and I'll talk to you in 2 weeks, and we'll pick it up in 1966, 67.
Okay. Thank you.
All right,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Christoph. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.